Hi, this is Brother Chuck Salam. I'm very excited. We're going to be looking at one of the most exciting prophecies to me in all of the Bible, and it's amazing how few Christians really understand this. This is a prophecy that was contained in the writings of Moses, and it was given 1,400 years before Jesus was born in Bethlehem. Now, the Bible is full of prophecies. There are dozens of prophecies about Jesus. Some of them are Western-style prophecies, and some of them are Eastern-style prophecies. The Eastern-style prophecy is a prophecy that's in the form of an allegory or an analogy. The best known one of that would be the Passover lamb. In 1 Corinthians chapter 5, when Paul is talking about the sin of sexual immorality in the church, he says, Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed, so now we eat the bread without yeast. This is the logic that he uses. The Passover lamb in Exodus chapter 12 was an allegorical style prophecy, which meant that all the elements in the Passover lamb story, which really happened, corresponded to something that happened later on in the life of Jesus. He was the male without defect. He was sacrificed at twilight. We are saved by the blood that was shed, that saves our bodies. None of his bones were broken while he was on the cross, and the people after that would eat a memorial meal every year to celebrate that. And then after the lamb was sacrificed, the people had a period where they would take all the yeast out of the house. They would have no yeast. And so the yeast represents sin. So Paul is making the point, after the lamb is sacrificed, then we do away with sin in our lives. So that's an example of an allegorical style prophecy. We're going to be looking in this lesson at another allegorical style prophecy contained in the very life of Moses itself. And perhaps one of the reasons why a lot of Christians don't know this is because they don't read the Old Testament that much. Most Christians, both in Europe, in America, and Asia, focus on the New Testament, and they don't read the Old Testament that much, so they don't know very much about the life of Moses. So we're going to be talking a little bit about that to understand the prophecy. So this is the gospel message is hidden in a story long before the time of Jesus. And I hope that this will strengthen your own faith in Christ, those of you who are Christians. It will help you be more effective in persuading other people to come to faith. And also, I hope it will inspire you to open your eyes and look more deeply into the Old Testament scriptures yourself. I want to begin by looking at something that Jesus himself said. We're going to turn to John chapter 5 and read verses 45 and 46. Jesus is speaking to people who question whether he is who he says he is. And he says in verse 45, "Do not think I shall accuse you to the Father. There is one who accuses you, Moses, in whom you trust. For if you believe Moses, you would believe me, for he wrote about me. But if you do not believe his writings, how will you believe my words?" So Jesus obviously here is speaking to Jewish people, and he's challenging them. He says, you're putting your faith in Moses. Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible. He gave the 10 Commandments. He says, you put your faith in Moses, but Moses is the one who wrote about me. So if you believe Moses, you believe in me. And a question that I ask Christians is, Jesus says Moses wrote about him. Where did Moses write about Jesus? And most Christians can't answer that question. Where did Moses write about Jesus? Well, we're going to take a look at that in our lesson today. Now, as I mentioned, Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. So the answer is going to be found somewhere in there. This also reminds me of Jesus in John chapter 1, when he found Philip and said to him, "Follow me." Philip went to find Nathanael, And he said, we found the one Moses wrote about in the law, and also the prophets wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph. So Philip tells Nathanael, this is the one Moses wrote about in the law. So they're talking about the same thing here. So what are Jesus, Nathanael, and Philip all talking about? Now, many people talk about the Messiah in the Bible. David and Daniel spoke about the Messiah, the Christ who is going to come in the future. Malachi talked about Elijah becoming before the day of the Lord. Isaiah wrote in Isaiah 53 about the suffering servant. Ezekiel wrote about the one shepherd that God would send in the future someday. But where did Moses write about this? Jesus says the same thing in Luke chapter 24 after he rose from the dead. He says, all things must be fulfilled that were written about me in the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms. And talking about his death, his suffering, his burial, and resurrection on the third day. So Jesus obviously explained it to the apostles where he fulfilled the prophecy of Moses. But we don't have an explanation in Luke chapter 24 when he explained it to the apostles. But one of the men in that room was the apostle Peter. And when Peter goes out to preach the gospel after that, in Acts chapter 2 and in Acts chapter 3 in Jerusalem, we see him talking about this thing that Jesus was referring to. Let's turn to Acts chapter 3. Peter says, for Moses truly said to the fathers, the Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among your brethren. Him you shall hear in all things, whatever he says to you. And it shall be that every soul who does not hear the prophet shall be utterly destroyed from among the people. So Peter goes on to say that Samuel and all the prophets after that spoke about the coming of Jesus. But he mentions one specific prophecy here in Moses. Let's turn back to that prophecy. Peter is quoting from the old Greek version, the Septuagint. So I'm going to read from the same version right here in Deuteronomy chapter 18, starting in verse 15. Now, just to give you an idea, this is about 1,400 years before Jesus. The Jews have crossed out of Egypt. They've gone through the wilderness. And this is near the end of Moses' life. In the book of Deuteronomy, he's retelling the story of all the things that have happened right before he dies. And many years beforehand, he had gone up to Mount Sinai and gotten the Ten Commandments. So he's talking about this much later. It's his last warning to the Jewish people. In verse 15, this is a very important prophecy. I want you to pay attention to every single word here. Deuteronomy 18:15, the Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from your brethren. Him you shall hear, according to all that you asked from the Lord your God in Horeb in the day of the assembly, saying, let us not hear again the voice of the Lord our God, nor let us see this great fire any more, lest we die. Then the Lord said to me, what they have spoken is good. I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among their brethren, and I will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak to them whatever I command. Therefore, whatever man will not listen to whatever the prophet speaks in my name, I will require it of him. So this is the prophecy that Peter is talking about in Acts chapter 3. He's saying that this prophecy, this is where Moses was writing about Jesus. Later on in the book of Acts, in Acts chapter 7, Stephen makes the same connection. He says that this prophecy is about Jesus. So when Jesus said, if you believe Moses, you believe me because he wrote about me, this is what he's talking about. Moses is recounting the story. He says to the people, remember when I went up to Mount Horeb, that's Mount Sinai, that's where he gave the Ten Commandments. The Lord came down on the mountain shook, the people were afraid, and they said to Moses, please don't have the voice of God speak to us anymore. You just tell us what he what he tells us. And Moses came down with the 10 Commandments. Moses is telling the people here, the 10 Commandments are in Deuteronomy chapter 5 and Exodus chapter 20. Here, Moses is retelling the story, and he says, actually, after the 10 Commandments, God gave me one more commandment. He said that in the future, I will send them, I will raise up a prophet like you from among their brothers, and they must listen to him. So Moses is saying there's going to be more that's revealed in the future. One prophet will come in the future, and the people must listen to him or they will be cut off. And this is the point that Peter is making. So there are many elements of this prophecy I want to take a look at here. First of all, I want to take a look at, he says he's going to raise up a prophet from among their brothers. Well, what does that mean? He's talking about, remember when God came down and spoke to us at Horeb at Mount Sinai? He's talking to the Jews. These were the people who came out of Egypt. He says it's going to be one of your brothers, the prophet. This prophet is going to be from among their brothers. That's the first thing. He's not going to be a foreigner. In the chapter before this, Moses says, when you appoint a king, it must be from one of your own brothers. He uses the same language. He says it can't be a foreigner. God says when you marry other people, it must be from among your brothers. It can't be a foreigner. He's talking to the Jews here. He's obviously saying this person must be a Jew. So whoever the prophet is, if he's not Jewish, he can't be the one that Moses is talking about here. So that's one important thing, that he had to be a Jew. He was going to be from their brothers. And then the next thing he says, it's going to be a prophet like you. The Lord will raise up a prophet like you. Now, when he says like there, I was thinking, well, what does that word mean? So I'm looking back. It's the same word that's used when he says that in Psalm 1, that the man who meditates on the word of God will be like the trees planted by streams of water. It's similar to. So he's saying that this prophet that comes will be one of their brothers, and he will be similar to Moses. Well, what does that mean? He's going to be similar to Moses or like Moses. Well, Moses, among all the prophets of Israel, there were so many prophets who came. There was Daniel and Isaiah and Jeremiah. There many prophets came, but he said there was going to be one prophet who'd be like Moses. Now, Eusebius, who was a bishop in the church in the early 300s, was talking about this prophecy, and he made a very powerful point. He said, among all the prophets, Moses was the only one who came with a set of laws. All the other prophets who came simply said, go back and follow the instructions of Moses. Now, people would ignore the prophets, but Moses brought the law. The other prophets said you need to go back and follow the law of Moses. They didn't bring new laws. So the first thing that Eusebius makes is that Jesus was the only prophet who brought about a new law. And when you think about that, think about in Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5. He talks about, he says, well, Moses told you do not commit murder, but I tell you, you can't even hate your brother. Moses told you don't commit adultery, but I tell you can't even lust. Moses said when you divorce your wife, you give a certificate of divorce, but I say you can't divorce her except for immorality. So Jesus came up with new laws. Moses said you have to worship God in Jerusalem, in the tabernacle, or later on in the temple. Jesus said you worship God everywhere. People will worship God in spirit and in truth everywhere. Moses had dietary laws that said you can eat these foods and you can't eat these other foods. Jesus did away with that. So this is what we see here, that Jesus, among all the prophets, came bringing new laws. So he was like Moses in that way. There are so many other examples. Eusebius points out many other examples that are similar to Moses and Jesus. I taught a class on this subject once in Boston to a group of students, and I gave them a challenge because they didn't know the book of Moses very well. They didn't know the 5 books of Moses. And I gave them a challenge. I said, what I'd like you to do is, I'm going to break up the life of Moses into different parts, and I'm going to have you read from the life of Moses, and you tell me in what ways is the life of Moses parallel to the life of Christ. How is he similar? In what way? And I said, I want you to look only at things that are unusual that they have in common. Not like they both wore sandals, or they were both Jewish, or they both ate breakfast in the morning, but things that were really unusual that only they shared, or only a very few people in the scriptures shared together. In what unusual ways was the life of Moses like that of Jesus? And I broke the life of Moses up into 5 parts, and I assigned it to people who were in the room. The first part was Moses' childhood and early life. I said, you group read Exodus chapter 1 to 5. The second group was Moses' battles with Pharaoh. And I said, you read Exodus chapter 6 and 7 and 10, 11, and 12. The third group, I said, you can look at the Exodus, how Moses led the people out of Egypt, the story of Exodus 13, 14, and 15, and then how Paul retells the story in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. The fourth group, I said, I want you to look at the time that Moses was leading people through the wilderness, through the desert for 40 years. So you read Exodus 17, 18, 19, 20, and also Numbers 21. And the last group, I said, I want you to look at the end of Moses' life, which is Numbers chapter 27 and Deuteronomy chapter 30 to 34. So I broke the group up into 5 parts, and I said, I want you to look at the 5 different parts of Moses' life, because they weren't that familiar with the Old Testament. You look at it, and then I said, and you tell me what you find that's parallel between Moses and Jesus, and I only want things that are very, very unusual, and let's pull together what we find from that. And I would encourage you to do the same thing on your own. If you're listening to this, you can stop the lesson at this point and try this out yourself, or you can do it in a class situation. Break up the life of Moses, look at it, and you're probably much more familiar with the life of Jesus than Moses, but look at the life of Moses and make a list of all the unusual similarities. And then we'll come back and we'll take a look at what the similarities are that we found. And that's what we did.